Let me do that. Looks like we're gonna get started. Just give it a moment for everybody to log in, and then we'll get started. All right, it looks like we are at time, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Chin Chun, and I'm with NACB and the Consultants Training Institute. Before we proceed with the Around the Valuation World International webcast for today, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. First, to obtain CP credit, you must answer all the poll questions that pop up on your screen during today's webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A option in Zoom to ask the presenter the questions. If you have any technical questions or questions about NACB or GACBA, please feel free to use the chat feature, as those will be directed to me. All right, and here's our page with our editors. We have Wolfgang Nies, Andrew Newman, and Pratik Shah. Wolfgang and Pratik will be joining us today, and Brian Jones is our advisor. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Wolfgang, who has a little message for us before we get started with the actual presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Chanda. Welcome to everybody. I'm looking forward to this great presentation. But I have one very short note on our conference. I would like to share my screen for a second, because our program for the EACVA International Conference in Berlin is ready now. The registration will be opened, I think, tomorrow or on Wednesday. So if you would like to have a look at this, go to valuationconference.de, and there you can find the program, which is already published. You can find overview over the speakers, and maybe you will know some of them, Roger Kripowski, for example, from an international perspective, or Dimitri Jakric, maybe Raphael Lesseau from Luxembourg, Jan Marek from the Czech Republic, Anna Marina from Ukraine, Antonella Pucca from New York, and Deborah Taylor from UK, from London. So it's just a selection on the international part. So we will have a full 2 days program in English. Yeah, and if you would like to come to Berlin, end of November, 1st of December, during the start of the Christmas market, it's just around the corner of the venue. We would be happy to see you there. So that's from my side, and yeah, it's a pleasure to me to hand over to Pratik and to listen to Dhara in just a second. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Wolfgang, and thank you everyone for being part of this interesting session today. I would like to first welcome Dhara on behalf of NACVA, GACAVA. It's great to see Dhara presenting today, because we have worked together for many years now, and she has been instrumental in building our firm together. She's part of our management team of NoCraft Analytics India. And, just from an academic background and overall, quick introduction about Dhara. So she has more than 15 years of experience with approximately more than 12 years of business valuation, investment banking experience, primarily in life sciences and the healthcare sector. She is currently, part of our management team and technical lead at NoCraft Analytics, where she works on different types of complex engagements. She also leads, learning and development team at NoCraft, where she is also involved in productivity and efficiency initiatives at the firm. Besides that, Dhara was instrumental in setting up ACVA India and ACVA RVO in India, which is in collaboration with NACVA. And besides that, she holds MBA from one of the top B schools of India, IIM, and she has done Bachelor's of Engineering. Plus, she holds a CBA designation and she's a CFA. Dhara was also among the few who was recognized as NSCVS 40 under 40, and she was, in the top 50 financial modelers of the world. So with that, Dhara, over to you. You can go ahead with the presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Prateek, for the introduction. Hello, all. Welcome. So I'll get started. I'll share my screen. My screen is visible to you? Okay. All right. So the agenda for today, we'll get started with an introduction to biotech with a brief explainer of key terms and how development and commercial life cycle for biotech companies is different from other industries. Then we'll also have a look at financing and transactions in the biotech industry. And finally, we'll see how it all comes together here with a few valuation examples. So the RNPV part, the risk-adjusted NPV, is the crux of valuation. So we'll probably cover that in a little more detail, and hence we might run through some of the other portions a little faster. Again, some of the data points and statistics that I'll present throughout this presentation might be from a US perspective, but the overall process, assumptions, and the methodology does not significantly change for major developed markets. And there will be a lot of similarities between the US and specifically the EU. So without much ado, moving to our presentation. But before I discuss about specifics on biotech companies, a quick distinction between what constitute biotech companies versus overall biopharma or pharma companies. So technically, biotech companies are those which produce biologic material, and we'll come to what's the distinction between a small molecule and biologic in a short bit. But this distinction no longer holds. But essentially, biotech companies are those that are smaller, leaner, and more R&D driven, whereas pharma or biopharma companies are those which are much bigger. So something like a Pfizer or a Novartis or a Sanofi or a Merck would be classified as biopharma, or rather a big pharma firm. And though there's no specific distinction in terms of what constitutes a big pharma versus a mid-size versus a small biotech firm, roughly any company that has a revenue about 10 billion is classified as big pharma. Anything between 1 billion to 10 billion of revenue is classified as mid-sized, and rest are relatively small, typically referred to as smaller biotech companies. A very specific aspect of biotech company is that they have a very long and structured drug development cycle, which is very heavily regulated. And it's very long in terms of it could last from anywhere between 7 to 15 years before a drug actually hits the market. This entire process is very capital intensive. It sometimes takes more than $1 billion to develop a drug. And there are also high chances of failure. So a drug first needs to enter human clinical trials, and there are high chances of failure there. But if the drug gets approved and it's commercially successful, the payout can be very high. So because of this structure, the biotech deals are structured this way, and the exits are planned in such a way that at every development milestones, they might happen. So we'll discuss this in a little detail. In terms of how financing works for biotech companies, for dilutive financing, there's more of equity infusion, and then that's preferred securities, and then there is convertible debt. So debt which could potentially convert to preferred security later. In terms of non-dilutive financing, where the dilution of equity doesn't happen, that happens through straight debt, non-convertible debt. licensing deals. These are mostly non-dilutive, could be dilutive sometimes. And we'll discuss licensing deals in a lot more detail, but essentially this is out-licensing one's drug or IP to another company, to grants from somebody like National Institute of Health in the US, or like the Horizon 2020 program that had started at the time of COVID. All of these are government or government agency provided grants, or outright sale of the company's assets to other entities. Those are also non-dilutive sources of financing. Now, for every biotech company, there are essentially two stages for drug. One is pre-commercialization, where the drug is being developed. Again, this is pretty long, very structured, regulated. And then there is post-commercialization. So the risks that are involved with development are captured by probability of technical and regulatory success, or probability of technical success, which we'll refer to as PTRS or PTS in short. And hence, because the drug development risks are captured through PTRS, the discount rate then only needs to account for commercial and operational risk. So when we'll come to NPV, or risk-adjusted NPV, as we say that, the discount rate will primarily only account for commercial risk. Another thing is that sales curve itself, post-commercialization, is somewhat different in the sense that the sales gradually increase in the first few years, then they suddenly jump, and then they stabilize. And there is a limited patent life and market exclusivity for these drugs. And this exclusivity matters because this is when all the investment gets captured. So these sales would be a return to the investment that has happened so far. Moving to some of the key biotech terms, because we'll we'll go through these as we go along. So there's a distinction for drugs for small molecule versus large molecule or biologic. So small molecular entities are those which are simple in structure, have a low molecular weight, and are relatively easy to manufacture. Whereas large molecule or biologics have a complex structure, large molecular weight, and follow a complex biotechnological process. So something like an aspirin is a small molecule, whereas a drug like Humira, which is a huge drug, marketed by AbbVie and used for the treatment of various autoimmune disorders, it's a biologic. Therapeutic area, that is the target for the drug, is also important because that determines the probability of approval, the sales, and the commercial outcome. So that would be, examples are cardiovascular drugs, autoimmune drugs, cancer drugs, respiratory drugs, and so on. Another factor that determines the market of a drug is prevalence and incidence. So prevalence determines what are the total number of cases of a disease in a population at a point in time. So for instance, if I say that there are 1 million patients of arthritis in the US right now, that represents prevalence. Incidence represents the rate of new cases of a disease in a population. So for instance, if I say in 2023, there will be 10,000 more cases of arthritis in the US, that represents incidence. So prevalence helps determine the current size of the drug, current market of the drug, whereas incidence helps determine the growth rate for that market. And you'll often hear terms like blockbuster drugs. So any drug which has annual sales greater than or equals to 1 billion in a year, that's referred to as blockbuster. So in terms of drug development life cycle, like I said, it's pretty long and very structured. So even before the drug goes for human clinical trials, there are a lot of steps. So first, internally, the biotech company will determine the target for the drug, then minimize the number of candidates for that drug. So only those which have the greatest possibility of success are selected. And I think there's a poll question, but I'll continue. And once that is determined, first these drugs are tested in animals to ensure that they are safe, and then that they are effective, so that when actually tested in humans, they could, that happens before it's tested in humans. And after this happens, an application known as investigational new drug application is submitted. This is submitted to FDA in the US. So that's the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates the drug development and approval process. The equivalent in the Eurozone is clinical trial application that's submitted to the EMA or the European Medicines Agency. If that gets accepted, then the clinical trials start in humans. And again, this process is also pretty long. So it's divided into 3 phases, phase 1, 2, and 3. In 1, essentially you test the drug for safety and what is the maximum possible dosage that could be tolerated. And hence these trials are done on healthy people, not the people who have those diseases. And the patients, or rather not the patients, but the volunteers on which you do this, they range from 20 to 100 in phase 1. And the probability that the drug will prove to be safe and transition to phase 2 is around 52%. In phase 2, the drug is actually tested for its effectiveness, whether it's effective against the disease for which it is going to be marketed for. And hence the number of patients also increases. It's tested on people who actually have that condition. So the number of patients could be several hundred. And because there's a real test of whether the drug is effective or not, the probability of this drug moving to next phase is low at just 29%. In phase 3 also, you test for efficacy or how effective the drug is, but here you test on many more patients. So potentially thousands of patients. And the possibility that the drug moves from phase 3 to actually filing for approval is a little more, 58%. Once all these phases are done and the outcomes that were desired are achieved, the drug is filed for new drug application. And if it is a small molecule, a new drug application is filed. If it is a biologics application is filed. And there's a marketing authorization application for the European Medicines Agency. And there's a very high probability of approval, given that the drug has already passed through 3 phases of trials. And once it's approved, it can be marketed. So, okay, so I think no questions so far. So we'll probably take the questions a little later. I'll move on. In terms of, so this is again a similar process as before, but this tells you a little more in terms of costs. So if you see here, So if you see here, the cost per launch, even before the drug goes to trial, these costs are significant. So roughly 1/3 of the cost of the total cost of development happen even before the drug goes for human trials. So essentially, this just goes on to show how long and expensive the process is. And even like a lot of time, a lot of years of development take place before the actual trials begin. And phase 1 trial typically takes somewhere between 1 to 1.5 years, phase 2 to 2.5 years, phase 3, 2.5 to 3 years. And the approval process itself could take anywhere between 1 to 1.5 years. So in terms of what we discussed, that this entire process is heavily regulated. So it's regulated by the Food and Drug Administration in the US, the European Medicines Agency in the Eurozone, though the final approval takes place through the European Commission, the MHRA in the UK, PMDA in Japan, NMPA in China. There are many more agencies, but these are the ones that are the major ones. In terms of even post-commercialization, the way for the biotech company or the biopharma company to get the value for the drug is through market exclusivity. So when there is market exclusivity, no other drug can be marketed. Only the drug which got approved can be marketed for that indication, or rather for that disease. So If it is a small molecule, this market exclusivity is 5 years. But if it is a biologic, the market exclusivity increases significantly. It's 12 years. And if within these 5 years or 12 years, the entity comes up with a new indication for the drug. So for instance, Humira, it was approved for arthritis. And then again, they came up with an indication for psoriasis, that it can treat psoriasis as well. They get additional 3 years of market exclusivity. In EMA, this exclusivity is 8 + 2, 10 years. And if there's a new indication for the same drug, then 1 additional year, so 11 years. If a drug is for treating a serious condition, which is rare, known as orphan disease, then that also increases the market exclusivity. And this market exclusivity is very critical because though there is a patent protection of 20 years, by the time the drug actually comes to market, very little of that patent protection is left. So this exclusivity is critical for the drug to get that runway to recover or, to get maximum possible sales. And there are also ways in which the drug development process can be accelerated. So even the regulatory agencies encourage that if the drug is very critical. So for instance, when COVID hit and the COVID vaccines needed to be approved, all these were fast-tracked. So what we are referring to as fast-track approval. And then there could be priority review. So the approval process takes between 1 and 1.5 years. But if it's a priority reviews, it could easily chop off, say, 6 months of that approval time. And that also gives the drug a lot of runway. But once the market exclusivity is done, the regulatory agencies allow other drugs to enter the market, known as generics or biosimilars. So generics are for small molecules, biosimilars are for biologics. And once these enter the market, the prices could significantly drop. So they could drop by as much as 70%. And because these prices drop and the governments are always looking to reduce the drug prices, they do actually encourage competition post the market exclusivity. And that's why the first entry as a generic player gets a 180-day market exclusivity as well. Okay, so coming to licensing in biopharma. So typically what happens is, as we've seen, that drug development could potentially take between 10 to 15 years. And if it's a smaller company, the company would not get any revenue till the drug is actually commercialized. So in order for them to get a part of this value sooner, they would out-license a part of their portfolio. So typically a biotech company might have 3 or 4 drugs in development. They might out-license one of these drugs to a bigger pharma company or a mid-sized pharma company, which makes them the licensor and the big pharma the licensee. And by doing so, the licensee benefits because then they get a pipeline of drugs to develop and launch into the market, and licensor benefits because it allows them to gain a part of the value. And second thing is, if they do not have those capabilities to actually launch the drug or don't have manufacturing capabilities or to successfully market as well as, say, bigger pharma companies, they tend to benefit. Some of them might not even have the financing required to go all the way because it's very expensive to develop drugs. So in that case, the licensor benefits. That's a smaller biotech company typically. And the way it happens is, in the very early stages, it's the universities which have this technology, and then they are the licensors. And a little later towards the drug development stage, the biotech companies are the licensor. And the way these licensing deals are structured is that there's upfront in terms of cash, which is immediately given to the licensor. Then there are certain milestones, which are both development and sales milestones. So development milestones could be, say, start of phase 2 clinical trial or approval of the drug. That's a potential technical milestone or a development milestone. And a sales milestone could be achieving a first time sales of 500 million are achieved in a year. That's a commercial milestone. Then there would be royalties, which you might have seen, and which could be simple. So like 3% of revenue would be paid every year to licensor, or it could be tiered. So up to say 500 million, 2% of revenue is paid as royalty, and post 500 million, 4% of revenue is paid as royalty. There are other structures also. So for instance, once the big pharma licenses the drugs, they could bear all or part of the R&D funding that the licensor incurs. Then this deal could also be more like a JV where there is co-development or co-marketing of the drug. And when typically universities license out the drugs, they want to limit their risk. So they, instead of taking milestone payments and royalties, they would just take annual payments, the annual payment every year of 100,000 until the deal is valid. And that limits the upside, but that also limits the downside risk. And then often there would be options involved where, the large pharma, the big pharma would say license one drug and say that we might potentially want to license another drug of yours in the future as well, but we'll monitor, and as we go along, we might license it, but for now, we'll just keep that option. Okay. So just to look at recent trends in biopharma licensing. So if you see here, this dark blue bars, they represent the upfront payment, and this entire bar represents the total deal value as part of licensing. So if you look from 2020 onwards, you see a decreasing trend in upfront payment. That's because, everybody is becoming a little more risk averse. And so though the deal size increased, total deal value increased in 2021, the upfront payment still decreased. So a lot of value is now shifting towards milestones and royalty. But nevertheless, as if the drug is advanced enough, the licensees are okay to pay a higher upfront payment. So you can see there's like 120% jump in upfront payment if the drug is in phase 2 versus if it is in phase 1. Briefly also covering the venture investments. So, this is basically the venture or P financing in biotech companies, early stage private biotech companies. And as you can see, this is like a downward trend starting from Q4 2020, where this was at its peak, both in terms of overall value of investment and the number of investments. And then it has gradually decreased, where it's pretty low right now. And this is the figure as of Q1 2023. And this has reached a number very close to what it was pre-COVID as of Q3 2019. But even here, you can see a trend that in later stage venture investments, either they have not declined as much. So if you see preclinical venture investment, they've declined significantly since the peak, whereas phase 2 hasn't declined as much. And phase 3 investments have even increased. So here too, there is a preference towards picking later stage assets. So in terms of exits also, the exits, after seeing a decline post 2020, things are looking up, at least in terms of M&A. IPO also, there's a slight uptick. So this is the figure till Q1 2023. There have been more IPOs in Q2 2023. So that's also looking better. So before I move to valuation, now I'll move to the main part, which is risk-adjusted NPV. But before I move to there, I'll just quickly check if there are any questions. I don't see any questions so far, so I'll move on. In terms of valuation in biotech, there are different applications where you would potentially need to do a valuation. So it could be for financial reporting, you value an entire company, or you value drugs, or you value a licensing transaction or an exit. So M&A transaction itself. So it could be part of purchase price allocations, could be part of fair value or gift and estate, or you have an actual deal. And we saw that a lot of licensing deals have milestones or royalty attached with them. So even a lot of M&A exits have milestones or royalty attached with them, which means that there would be a lot of value which would be contingent in achieving certain milestones. Then how the licensing deals would be structured, and we had seen the value captured. So if it is a very early stage drug, then most of the value would be with the licensee, because the licensee would still have to develop the drug till the end. Whereas if it's like a drug which is in phase 3 or it has been approved, bulk of the value would be with licensor, because they've already taken the drug to very close to approval, or they've got it to approval. And now the only risk that remains with the licensee is to actually commercialize it and make it commercially successful. So coming to risk-adjusted NPV. So if you are going to value a drug, this is the method that you use. So this is essentially a modification of NPV or net present value method. And even if you are valuing a biotech company, typically you value it as sum of parts, where you have, say, 3 or 4 or 5 different assets. You value each of them, and the sum of their value, after making few more adjustments, is the value of the company. Now, the key considerations that you have here are the probability of technical success. And we discussed this a little where we saw that probability of technical success is what's the probability of a drug that was in phase 1 to successfully complete phase 1 and start phase 2, and so on and so forth. Then the sales, like what is the maximum potential sales that could be achieved by the drug, and what is the curve. So how will it reach there? Then development time and costs while the drug is being developed. And all of these are largely dependent upon the therapeutic area, which we had seen later. So whether it's cardiovascular or whether it's oncology or respiratory, that heavily determines what is the probability of technical success, peak sales, as well as development time. And then as we saw, that market exclusivity is very critical, because that's where bulk of the value comes in. And then discount rate, as we had discussed earlier, probability of technical success already takes care of the regulatory and the development risks. So the discount risk basically just takes care of the commercial and operational risks that the company has. And how detailed you have each of these factors depends upon the scope. So for instance, if there's a market assessment that needs to be done to take a call whether to launch a drug or not, a lot of focus needs to be there on sales development and how the sales forecast would be. But if not, if the scope doesn't require that, then the peak sales could be determined just based on looking at comparable drugs and what their sales have been. Moving on, so probability of technical success is, so here you can see this is actual data based on 10 years of, looking at clinical trials. This is a study done by Biopharma Intelligence and QLS, where they analyzed more than 4,000 drugs in a span of 10 years. And they had an overall success probability, but the success probability varies quite a bit based on which therapeutic area is being targeted. So, for example, if we look at respiratory, so the probability that a drug which is right now starting phase 1, for it to complete phase 1 is 55.9%. Similarly, a drug which is already in phase 2, it has started phase 2, but for it to complete phase 2 and move to phase 3, the probability is 21.9%. But this 55.9 and 21.9, 55.19 and 21.9, these are standalone probabilities. But if you want to determine that if there is a drug which has started phase 1, it has just started phase 1, what is the probability of its approval? So the way you get it is 55.9% into 21.9% into 64.5% into 95.6%. So overall, it's just 7.5%. So a drug that started human clinical trials, for it to get approved if it is a respiratory drug, its overall probability is 7.5%. If the drug has not yet started clinical trials, then the probability becomes even low. And we'll see this as we go through examples. In terms of sales, what is the most important is the peak sales, the highest possible sales that the drug can get. If you are doing a more detailed analysis, then you need to look at what we had discussed in terms of prevalence and incidence, the number of people afflicted with that disease right now, which is prevalence, and new cases expected, which is incidence. That will help determine the market size and the growth in the market. Then you also look at what are the current drugs and what new problem is your drug solving. So is the drug much more effective? Is it much more safer? In that case, the potential of sales are higher. Then you also need to look at dosing frequency. So is it a drug oral that needs to be taken daily? Is it an injectable that needs to be injected monthly? All these determines the revenue. And obviously the reimbursement landscape, how many clinicians are prescribing it, how the payers are paying for it, all that. And as we had discussed, after exclusivity, there's a significant revenue loss because other players come in and potentially revenue can be depleted by 50, 60, 70% or even more. Another way to look at peak sales is to look at what are the comparable products, how your product compares to them, and what is the potential sales that can be achieved. Besides the peak sales, how we get to the peak sales also matters. So typically it takes, this is based on studies, and if you see this black lines, this represents the median time to reach peak sales. So if you see the median time to reach peak sales ranges between 5 to 6 years. And the way they reach the peak sales is through, this is like roughly an S-shaped curve. So essentially it will grow a little slower in the initial years, then the sales would accelerate, sales growth would accelerate, and then it will start flattening. The development R&D costs, they also vary based on therapeutic area, and this is an indication. But a lot of times this is a little older studies. Now these costs have increased even more. And not just the development costs, the costs before launching also matters. So you need to do some launch related activities like marketing or developing a new manufacturing plant, which is additional. And even post commercialization, when you look at R&D costs or G&A or sales and marketing costs, the way you can determine this is by looking for trends from mid-sized pharma companies, because you can assume that in 10 to 15 or 20 years, our biotech companies would reach a level at which mid-sized pharma companies are potentially right now. Okay, so sorry, I didn't get this question. There's some question of probability of success for, I don't know which vaccine. And there's one more question. Are the mentioned sources for PTRS free to access? Yes, it is. At the end of the slides, I've even put in the sources with the links so you can access them. So this is a freely available study. Though there are more sources available for probability of technical success that are even paid, they might be behind paywall, but a lot of them are available for free. So going to the examples, so first example that we'll cover is where the drug is actually being developed by the pharma company and we want to know what's the value of that drug right now. And the second example, we'll see what happens if the drug is out licensed to a bigger company. So in the case where the drug is being developed by the pharma company and they will incur all the expenses and take it all the way to commercialization and beyond. So the example we are taking is for an autoimmune drug, which is a biologic. So if you remember the biologic, they have 12 years exclusivity in the US. Even in Europe, they would have close to 10 or 11 years of exclusivity. So an assumption of 12 years won't be very off even there. So assume that this drug has filed IND. So basically it has applied to start clinical trials in humans, and it will start the phase 1 clinical trials soon. The expected peak sales are expected to be 1.25 billion or 1250 USD millions. There's expected to be S-curve, expected years in which it will reach this 1250 million is 5 years. And beyond peak also, it's not like the peak sales stop at 1250. They would grow at inflation or a little higher rate. So we have assumed it to be 5%. And given that by the time it loses exclusivity, it would be almost 20 years. For simplicity, we have assumed that there will be no sales post loss of exclusivity, though technically there are sales and value is added. For our example, we've assumed it to be 0, given that the discount factor would be low, very low for it to matter. We have assumed, taken broad assumptions, 50% of sale is operating margin. So cost of goods sold, operating expenses are 50%. 5% of sales is net working capital, and we have assumed capex to be equals to depreciation, so they offset each other. Discount rate 15%. Remember, these only need to account for commercial risk, not development risks. Tax rate 25%. These are the costs for development at each stage. So 15 million at phase 1, 40 million at phase 2, and there are 2 years for phase 2 development. So we are assuming that it's 20 million for each year, 80 million for phase 3, and launch costs will also be there, which will be 20 million. Now, how did we get this 55.2, 31.4 numbers? So if we back up a few slides. So if you see here, autoimmune 55.2, 31.4, 65.3, 94.1. So these are the probabilities based on the public sources, and we have taken these. This 1, 2, 3, 1. So if we had looked at the earlier image, so it approximately takes 1 to 1.5 years for phase 1, 2 to 2.5, or 2.5 to 3 for 3. And that's what we have taken as an indicator. Now, this part is important. So essentially, our drug is going to start phase 1, right? So the probability of it completing phase 1, or probability of it starting phase 1 is 100%. Probability of it completing phase 1 is 100% into 55.2%, so 55.2. Now, the probability of that drug to complete phase 2 is the probability of that drug entering phase 2, which is 55.2, and then completing phase 2. So you multiply 55.2 by 31.4, so 17.3, and so on. So now the probability of that drug to complete phase 3 is 17.3 into 65.3 to 11. That's equals to 11.3. And the probability of it getting approved is 11.3 into 94.1, so 10.7. Now, these are the calculations. So essentially, this is split across 3 slides. So in the first slide, I'm just showing 7 years, which is up to approval. Then we'll show commercialization. So here, obviously, there are no sales. There are just development expenses, 15 million for phase 1, 40 million for phase 2, split across 2 years, so 20 each, 80 million split across 3 years of phase 3, so 26.7 million, and then launch costs of 20 million. So we won't have any operating costs, we won't have any change in working capital, but we will have probability of success. So this drug is already in phase 1. So it's, the probability of it being in phase 1 is 100%. But the probability of it being successful in phase 1 is just 55.2%. So it entering phase 2, the probability is 55.2. Similarly, we multiply 55.2 with 31.4 and get to 17.3. That's its probability to end up phase 3. And then probability to complete phase 3 is 11.3. And then finally, probability of it getting approved is 10.7. So whatever be the cash flows, you first multiply it by cumulative probability of success, and then you discount it. And we have assumed mid-period discounting here. From this point onwards, the drug becomes commercial. Remember, it will remain commercial for, it will have market exclusivity for 12 years. So that's why we have assumed from year 8 to year 19, we have taken the sales. Beyond loss of exclusivity, we have assumed for simplification, there are no sales because sales significantly decline. So here we first take the peak sales, which is 1.25 billion, but it's not that they reach that peak sales in the first year of commercialization. They follow an S-shaped curve. So the first year they'll reach like 9% of the sales and they'll get to 114 million, then 25.2, 50 and so on. And by, if you look here, which is almost year 6, they are very close to the peak sales. And then we take the cost during commercialization, apply tax rate, apply change in working capital, still multiply by the cumulative probability of success, which is 10.7%, get to a number and apply discount factors. And this is until the end of exclusivity. Okay, second, I think there are a few questions. So the probability of autoimmune product approval is only 10%. Yes. So if the cumulative probability is only 10%, so if the drug is just starting human clinical trials, its probability of approval is only 10.7%. But if the drug is ahead in development phase, so for instance, the drug was already in phase 2, then the probability increases. Right, because now it becomes 31.4% into 65.3% into 94.1%. So it becomes closer to 18% instead of 10.7%. And so I'll just complete that and we can take all the questions. So this is the last part before we move to questions. Now, if we assume the same drug that we had assumed before, an autoimmune drug, which is a biologic, just going to start phase 1, same peak sales assumption of 1.25 billion, and obviously the same probability, same time to development. But here you assume that instead of developing the drug all the way, the biotech company simply out-licenses the drug to a big pharma so that they don't need to incur any more R&D expenses from now on. And they receive the licensing deal related payments. So they receive an upfront payment, then development milestone related payments, commercial milestone related payments, and royalties. So here for simplicity, we've assumed discount rate to be same, 15%. We have assumed that they receive upfront payment of 1 million, that they receive immediately, royalty on sales 3% flat. Then as soon as they start phase 2, they receive an amount of 7 million USD. And if you remember in year 2, they would start phase 2. So they would receive this amount in year 2. As soon as they start phase 3, they would receive 10 million. And in the first year of launch, first year of commercialization, they would receive 12 million. And the very first year where they would hit a sales or annual sales of 700 million or more, they would receive 25 million as milestone payment. So if you look here, this is when the phase 2 starts. So the assumption is here, they'll get 7 million. This is where phase 3 starts. So here they'll get 10 million. You assume same cumulative probability of success. So the probability of phase 1 getting successfully completed and phase 2 starting was 55.2%. So this amount post-tax is multiplied by cumulative probability of success, and then the discount factor is applied. Same thing for phase 3, the probability of phase 1 and phase 2 getting completed is 17.3%. So that's what we have multiplied. And the very first year of launch, that is year 8, they'll get 12 million. And to that we multiply the overall probability of approval, 10.7%. And then we have a similar sales curve as we had seen in the last example. So if you see here, this is the first year when they hit 700 or more. So up to here, it was 625. This is where they hit 700. So that's why the 25 million milestone is received here. And as soon as the drug goes commercial, they start receiving royalty, which is this line. So the sum of all the milestones and royalties are the cash flows. And yeah, so that's what we have added. And basically, what we are doing here is taking the sum of present value of milestone and royalty payments. That comes to 8.3 million. And the upfront they get immediately. So we simply add that, that comes to 9.3 million. This is in comparison to when they were developing the drug and they were getting 32.6 million. But remember, in this case, they took up a lot of risk because they were developing through commercialization. Okay, so I'll stop sharing and I can move again to specific slides, but I'll take questions first. Okay, so one of the questions is that you could value a company by summing the value of the component drugs. Does that take into account overhead or other period costs into account? So good question. In terms of, at least like we discussed, biotech companies are much leaner compared to some of the bigger pharma companies. So a lot of their expenses are actually R&D. They don't have a lot of other expense. Their employee costs also consist primarily of the scientific team. So if it is a reasonably early stage biotech company, you could potentially just take some of parts of the drugs, and that would be the value of the company. In some cases, besides the drug, the biotech company would also have a platform. So platform essentially is a technology through which they generate the drugs. And that platform, because it could also generate more drugs in the future, also has value. So that could also be valued separately and added to the value of standalone drugs. Any other questions? I think, let me just check in my chat.
Dhara, thank you very much. I have one further question. You talked a lot on probabilities. What is your experience in this arena working with Monte Carlo simulation? Is it a useful tool? Do you have some experience on this?
Yes. So so Monte Carlo simulation, it's used in a couple of ways. So one thing which I discussed is that often in a licensing deal, there's an option. So essentially the big pharma would license one drug right away, but they would say that we'll keep an option that maybe 1 or 2 years from now, if we find that drug to be really valuable, we'll probably exercise that option. And in some of these cases, the probabilities, they are simulated. So you either take a 0 or 100. So obviously the possibility that the drug will move from one phase to another phase, when you are simulating, you take say 50,000 or 100,000 simulations. But for every simulation, the drug will either move to the next phase or it will not. But overall, the average of those should average the probabilities that we discussed. So for the autoimmune drug, if we are saying 55% was the average probability of moving from phase 1 to phase 2, across 10,000 simulations, there will be 5,500 simulations where the drug will move to the next phase, and there will be roughly 4,500 simulations where it will not. So that's how we essentially take it when we do Monte Carlo simulation. Another application of Monte Carlo simulation would be when we have contingent and a lot of value. For instance, if we are saying the sales milestone is achieving, say, a 700 or 500 million sales milestone. So often in that case, if scenario analysis is not used, we use something like a Monte Carlo simulation to simulate the sales, also taking into account these probabilities.
Yeah, thank you. There's one more question from Tom. The probabilities, are they included in the disclosure schedule or term sheet?
So the way the probabilities are considered, so this is primarily for, modeling, and they often, so either we do it post once a deal has taken place, or like financial reporting, or we do this before, the terms of a deal are decided. So for instance, if I am on the licensor side and I want to, check how much value I could get, what I would do is, for the drug I'm developing or licensing out, I would look at what are the standard probabilities for the drug so far, look at all the market data and the studies that have been done, and use that to determine the value. And like we had seen this chart, that if it is an early stage drug, the licensor would want at least 10 to 20% of the value. So the terms are then designed in such a way that 20% of the value comes to the licensor, 80% to the licensee. And if it's a late stage drug, say a phase 3 drug, the licensor would want at least 50% of the value. Then we would, the milestones would be high enough that so that accounting for the probability of success, still the licensor gets 50% of the value. So basically, this is based on studies and help to determine value either post or before the terms are decided.
Thank you.
And I think there's one more question. Is the issuer required to disclose those calculations? If requested, yes. Sometimes they may, sometimes they may not. If it is for something which is reporting purposes, often these terms are disclosed at least to the auditors, if not to the public at large.
There's one more. I think we can take the last question. It says, how do you select the discount rate? Industry level only, or with risk premiums added in it?
Yes, so there are studies even on this. These studies are a little dated, but even accounting for the development risks, because the early stage biotech companies don't have that manufacturing muscle or the marketing muscle, the discount rates for them are high. So they range between, say, 12 to 20%, or rather 15 to 20%, sometimes even as high as 25%. And then there are risks because they might not even get financing if these are private companies. And for a little mid-stage companies, they range between 12 to 18%. And then for the larger companies, they range between 10 to 15%. So again, these are studies. Then there are observations of what are the discount rates for publicly traded companies in the market, roughly based on KPIM. But yeah, typically additional, you could do a KPIM-based structure and add that. But generally, these are the ranges based on potentially which stage the company is in. And there are studies for this too.
I think there's a question from Christian. Is there a good methodology to check the plausibility of peak sales if you are presented with the business plans from the client, given the prevalence and incident values are available, but not market penetration? Correct.
So one of the, even if we are developing a very detailed sales analysis based on prevalence, incidence, an entire epidemiology study where you look at diagnosis, compliance, etc., still a good indicator would be to look at comparable products in the market. So for example, now there are definitely nuances to that, whether your product is very similar to some product already existing, or there is, it's very different. It's like a completely new drug. But often looking at these products which are already there in the market gives you a good enough indication whether the estimates are way off or they are close. There are often disclosures in 10K, at least for major drugs. So there are a lot of paid sources where you can get actual sales information like Red Book or IQVIA. But even if you look at 10Ks, provided the companies that marketed these drugs are public, and these are major drugs, you get an information of what the sales were each year, and that way also you get an idea of how the sales of these drugs went historically.
Yeah, I think we are out for time. So Chanda, over to you.
Sorry, Pratik. Looks like we're out of time. So
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Thank you for Dhara for this impressive presentation and this deep dive into the challenges with, yeah, unforeseeable future. We will have a short summer break with our rounds of Valuation World. We will come back in 4 weeks with Dr. Mark Purkema from the Netherlands, and he will talk about behavioral valuation. So we will dive a little bit in the psychological field of business valuation. And yeah, let's have a look what will happen at the end of August. And take care. Have a great summertime. Thank you, Dhara. Thank you, Pratik. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Chanda. And see you in 4 weeks. Have a great time. Thanks.
You. Thank you. And in case if you have more questions, the presentation has my email ID. You can mail me.
Thank you, Dhara.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.